Here is a common lesson that I do with students that are getting a foothold in improvising. And as guitar players, our first step seems to be improvising on a blues background. That seems to be a great leading way to playing on other types of songs, and it seems to be fairly universal in people wanting to learn how to do that. So I opened up with a fairly sparse solo because that's what I'm trying to head people to start off with. Now, I'm just going to adjust this mic because it's popping a bit. So one of the daunting things about learning solos is that we kind of learn them. Guitar in general is kind of guilty of learning things maybe in the wrong order, or certainly a different order than we do in other instruments. So what we're doing is we learn a bunch of scales, and there's lots of videos on this topic, the scales that we use in blues improvising, and one of the confusing things about learning scales, and scales are important, I'm not downplaying that in any way, shape, or form, is that somebody says, here are all the notes that you're going to need to play, which kind of implies these are all the ingredients you have to put in to make a solo sound like something, and that's not necessarily true. So my first serious instrument was actually playing the drums, and I still play the drums to this day. And one of the things we need to notice about drummers is they make a lot of music with like a handful of notes, a lot of music. And when it's time for them to solo, really good drummers, and even not so great drummers, can do it with like a couple of notes. Sometimes just on a snare drum, one note. Now on guitar and other instruments, we don't have access to two sticks. We have one pick and one fingering hand, and we don't have access to a lot of the techniques that we can use on the drums that go with the two hands, and bouncing sticks and dribbling and rudiments and things like that. But what we do have access to is just playing one note. So the backing track that I'm using here, and that I will post elsewhere so that you play along, is in the key of A. So we have our 5 positions of the pentatonic scales in A minor. We use the minor pentatonic idea against the major chords, and that relationship between the major chord, the dominant 7 chord with the major third, and the minor third is what gives the tension and release that is so attractive about playing the blues. All right, having said that, we don't want to have to necessarily honk on one note. We certainly don't want to be in the position of trying to jam all 12 notes. As a quick aside, and I am promising to get to my particular version of teaching the 5 positions of the pentatonic scales, I don't like to call them by their traditional names, position 1, position 2. That is just so uninteresting sounding. And because they are the same notes in different positions on the guitar, they can be more than just, in this case, the A minor pentatonic played in the 2nd position, or in the 5th position. I like to give names anyway. So the A minor pentatonic's got a name, and the one below it's called the suspended pentatonic, and the one above it's called the major pentatonic, and then we have 2 other names for the pentatonics, the sus7 and the flat 6. Those are not common names, and but they're more fitting because they do remind us what the degrees are. That's another video. This video is about how to build a solo with the material at hand, without trying to stuff a bunch of notes in. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to do the exact same backing track, and I'm going to play one note. The one note I'm going to play is the root of that scale. It's the root of our first chord, the A7 chord. It is the 5th of the 4 chord, which would be the D7, and it's kind of not a great note to play against the E, but following the prescription of improvisation type musics, that a good rhythm will always supersede a good note. So a good note played out of time sounds terrible. A bad note played in time sounds better. All right, so I'm just going to play this A. Here are all the things that are kind of at my disposal for playing that A. One, I can just play the A. I can play the A again. I can also have varying degrees of pressure on this A, where I can get a more percussive sound or even a completely percussive sound. Don't want to do too much because then you're doing the chicken picket. Right? But a little bit of... I can slide into the note. If you're a nitpicker, you might think that that note that I'm sliding into is a second note, but in traditional notation, that would be shown as a grace note, which is not a note. So we can slide into it from above, from below, from 2 frets, from 1 fret, etc., etc. Okay, so here we go. Just one chorus playing with the one note. That's the one note. Not super interesting, and I kind of had the tempo wrong off the top because there's a tempo I had in my mind, and then one I had already programmed were 2 different ones. But you get the idea. So then we're going to add in another note. It can be any note, but I'm going to make it in the key of A, the flat 7. So the A is the, as previously mentioned, is the root of our first chord, the 5th of the second chord, and the 4th, not a great note, of the 5 chord. Our G now becomes the flat 7 of the root chord. It becomes the 4 of the 4 chord with not a great sound, and it becomes the sharp 9 or blues note of the 7. So it has carries a lot of weight. Okay, and do one chorus. One more thing. So one other thing we can do now that we have more than one note is we can play at different places, and this is part of learning the fretboard, that I can play these 2 notes here. I'll keep the A on that one, but play it on the second string. Can keep the G on the second string and play the A here. Play it completely different on the 3rd string up here. And you should be able to hear the difference in tone. This one is a little brighter, little combination, a little darker. Same note, same volume, same everything, but just a little different sound. So all of a sudden you have that extra variable in there. We have the 2 notes with 3 different kind of tone sets. All right, same idea. I'm going to wait till I hear a couple of beats before I start playing, so it'll sound a little bit more in time. That's 2 notes. Next logical course is to play 3 notes. I'm going to pick these 3 notes. All right, and just right off the bat, when you hear that, you go, man, that sounds like a few things I've heard before, and because it does. All right, so I'm just going to launch into it. So, and I can play it here. All right, same 3 notes, 3 different very sounds, very different sounds, different positions, the whole thing. Same idea. So on and so forth. Guess what's coming next? 4 notes. So at this point, it's wide open. You just have to pick 4 notes. I am picking 4 notes in line of the scale. Okay? So 4 notes, I'm going to pick the D. So in this position, it's very nice to go here. All right? And just fool around with that way. Same idea. notes, and then we're up to 5 notes, and so then we have basically a lot of what we'd be playing. So 5 notes here to me would probably be just either adding the C note here or the C note here. So in our sort of everybody's home position of A minor pentatonic, notes are the top 3 strings. So on and so forth. All right, here we go. In case you thought I was cheating and playing other notes that I didn't talk about, I was still just playing the C, the D, the E, the G, and the A. Played another C here, played this D here, played this G. I played them just different positions. I was just sort of sticking to the top 3 strings rather than the same sort of notes, right? But I'm limiting myself, and by limiting my choices, I'm kind of like when you go into a restaurant. It's one of those restaurants that serves everything from steak to sushi and everything in between, and it's a huge list, and you can't choose because you have too many choices, and you're trying to figure out what they do well. Same idea. When you have all the notes to play in all the positions, and 12 notes in each position, before you even add in the flat 5 or the blue note, that's a lot. All right, so here's some other sort of helpful things that I found that has worked when imparting to students. Number 1, it's a handful of rules or guidelines or suggestions when you're playing a solo. One is, rule number 1, the next note is not always a note. So that's called leaving space. So instead of going, that you go, next note's not necessarily a note. It could be not playing a note. Next note is not always the next note. So that's kind of what we were focused on here, was playing the same note more than once. When you only had one note, there was no other note to go to. Only one note to play, and articulating around that, obviously the next note's not another note. So rule number 1, next note's not always a note. And rule number 2, next note's not always the next note in the scale. That also implies that you don't have to just go up the scale some way, although by breaking it up with rhythms and space, sounds pretty good. But you can also just change your intervals. With the pentatonic scales, because there's 5 notes and there's already a built-in spaces, it's not quite as necessary, but you can. And the next note's not always a different note, which is, again, the other half of the focus of this lesson, was playing the same note twice. Right? Which relies a lot more on your right hand, which we want to be able to do that. Another little trick you can do, it's not so easy to do, is to play the same note in 2 different places. So I'm just playing that A note. That's a little trick anyways. All right, so that's lesson 1, improvising with a handful of notes, relying on rhythm, phrasing, and space. That's what it probably should be titled. I just got to it at the end. All right, till the next lesson.